The thing with my resume, I should be clear at the very beginning. I've been educated beyond my intelligence. It's as simple as that. What I want to do, I'm going to say a few words about my article, but really to my mind, the two main speakers are the two editors. So let me introduce them to you so you know who they are, and then I'll give a little bit of presentation of my one article in the book, and then Beverly will speak. Beverly, you're going to be second, or? Yeah. Do you want to speak first now, though? You want me to do my article? Oh, good. No. Then we misunderstood. So let me introduce Beverly, and then she'll speak. This is good. Yeah. So this is Dr. Beverly Musgrave. She's a native of Nova Scotia. I've known her since we studied together in Ottawa in 1974, 1975. Before that, she had trained as a spiritual director in Guelph under John English. I have to say, in Ottawa, in our class, she was clearly the best student, with no question. She has a diploma in pastoral psychotherapy. She has the M.A. in pastoral counseling from the University of Ottawa. She has a diploma in pastoral psychotherapy at Blanton Peel in New York City, which she got in the early 80s. And she has a doctorate in psychology from the Fielding Graduate University in California, which she got in 1990. For many years, she's been a psychotherapist in New York City, private practice. Somewhere in the early 80s, she became a fellow in the American Association of Pastoral Counselors. She's also a licensed mental health practitioner in the state of New York. Beverly's been at Fordham since about 1990. And she's a professor of pastoral care and counseling there. And one of the areas she developed was this area working with people who are suffering from illness, spiritual aspects of that and psychological aspects of that. And then soon after that, she devised a program called Partners in Healing in 1994. And she would train people to work, mainly in parish settings, to work with people who were just getting out of hospital, who were bedridden or whatever, in terms of just taking care of people who were suffering from illness. Like else to say, a very good friend of mine for years. To my mind, an exceptional individual. And so it's a privilege to introduce her to you. Thank you.
First, I would like to thank Melinda Donovan for your gracious hospitality, your organizational skills, and your attention to details was deeply appreciated. Thank you. And secondly, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this book signing. After a morning of classes, and in this sweltering sun, I'm sure the sun has been inviting you to the beach, but instead you're here. So thank you sincerely. It's an honor and a privilege to make this presentation with two of my best friends and colleagues, Dr. John Shea and Dr. Neil McGettigan. I'm not sure, but I'm wondering if this is the first time that this Jesuit institution has two Augustinians presenting at the same time. Let me clarify how we will spend our time together. First, I'm going to offer you a brief outline about how this book came into being, and then Dr. McGettigan will give you a brief overview of the book, and then all three of us will offer some reflection on the content of the book. I would like to begin with a short poem by Mary Oliver. Her poem synthesizes and embodies the spirit, the heart, not only of the book itself, but of how the book came into being. And this is her poem. Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was gift. 20 years ago, I received a black box full of darkness, a critical, debilitating illness. I was fortunate in that I had great medical care, a wonderful spiritual director, a therapist that understood the psychological implications of illness, an extremely loving family and friends. When I was able to reflect on my experience, I realized how tremendously fortunate I was. I had the right combination of professional and personal support. But when I looked around so many people in New York City, I thought many of these folks do not have this kind of help. So I invited 10 or 12 people from different professions, different religions, different cultures to meet. And we met for once a month for a year. In that year, we developed a program to assist parishioners, community members, living at home or in hospital, how to deal with their illness. The program, very briefly, focused on 4 psychological elements: the medical, theological, spiritual, the psychological, and the social. In 1991, we developed a nonprofit organization called Partners in Healing. Partners in Healing is an interfaith and multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious group who work together in partnership, a partnership of love to assist the sick. Training programs were conducted with leaders in parishes, training them how to go out and visit the sick, not just within the community, but within the larger community at large. I taught this Partners in Healing program at Fordham University to our pastoral counseling and pastoral care students, and developed 6 conferences at Fordham on various topics. This book comes from the Partners in Healing organization, the Fordham conferences, and from the wonderful people dedicated to the partnership of healing and care. And I'm going to now ask Dr. McGettigan to tell you a little bit about the sections in the book.
This is just to give you some idea who Father McGettigan is before he speaks. And he can speak for a long time, I need to tell you that. So, and I'll be very brief. He's an Augustinian priest, retired now at Villanova University. For many years, he taught English at Monsignor Bonner High School outside of Philadelphia. He has an ABD in English from the University of Pennsylvania, and then he taught English at Merrimack College here in North Andover for almost 10 years, and he was also in administration for a few of those years. In 1975, he got a master's in pastoral studies and an MPS in pastoral counseling at St. Paul University in Ottawa. And then after that, he served in campus ministry in Florida. And then he served in a number of parishes. But during that time, he studied for a Doctor of Ministry degree in pastoral counseling from New York Theological Seminary, and he got his degree in 1986. And in 1988, He went to Villanova University, where he taught religion and literature, psychology and religion, and the freshman course in theology, which he loved to teach because he would mix a lot of contemporary understandings of science and evolution with theology. And the course, of course, was very well received, and he loved to teach it. He's a superb writer and editor, which is one of the reasons why he's here, because he did a lot of the editing. And he has 2 chapters in the book. And we have been very good friends since Merrimack College, which is back late 60s, before some of you were born. Not too many here, but some were born. So, also a very good friend of mine for years and years, Father Neil McGettigan.
The first thing I want to say is, it's an intimidating crowd. You're so big. And it makes me feel that you expect a lot. Oh, I want to do one thing. It's just one person standing back there? Okay, because we have chairs up here. Okay. All right. I'm supposed to explain, because Beverly is the boss of everything. And I'm glad it's right up here because I won't forget it. The theological dimensions of illness. That is our main title. And I put down a few things that I think are theological. But illness has a gift of bringing all those things together. The things that we separate in academic circles. You know, you're an expert in science, you're an expert in mathematics, you're an expert in sociology or whatever else. But life is not that simple. I don't know whether maybe a lot of you will remember M. Scott Peck when he introduced his bestseller that was on the New York Times for a record run of bestseller books, The Road Less Traveled, which he stole that title from the New England poet. That's made all the difference. Who was that? Was it Robert Frost? He was from New England? That's amazing. No, but the simplicity of that. So the first sentence in his book was something that we all need to find out. And that is, life is difficult. Now we may want to amend that simple statement, because it sounds pretty harsh, doesn't it? Life is difficult, but it's truth. And what all these chapters in the book tell us is truth. And the theological dimensions are simply telling us that when we get sick, and it's going to happen sometime, sometimes it's just a cold. You know, those winter colds that you get up here in the cold country in Massachusetts and all that. You suffer that a lot. Anyway, it happens. But then as you get older, the sicknesses may tend to be a little more serious. And then you need to have something that we call theological dimensions. That's what you believe. That's what you believe life is for, the purpose of life, why we're living. Remember that old song, Why Was I Born? Why Am I Living? What am I getting out of life? What am I giving? All those things. They're theological. They're very popular, but still they're theological. And we have to face those things. We have to face them. And when we do face them, we're building our theology. Now what happened when we come to part 2 is that they decided they were going to separate theology from something else. And so they took that word, theological, they said, we don't want that. That's all religious. We don't need that kind of stuff. We're going to be psychologists. And so they took the Greek word, which is psyche, and you know what that means, don't you? You do. I hear you saying yes. What does it mean?
The study of the soul.
Study of the soul. That's exactly it. And Sigmund Freud said, yeah, he's the father of modern psychology. So everything that's called psychology really is dealing with your spirit, your soul. That's why we call it, what do we call this book? Oh, we call it the spiritual and psychological aspects. Aspects of, that's it. Aspects of illness. So illness makes us forget about these categories. And really what the book is telling you is what people have learned from living, and what they had to learn is what M. Scott Peck said, life is tough. But the toughness of life is going to teach us that we're going to have something to believe in. We're going to have to discover our beliefs. And then we're going to have to say, do I really believe them? And then something is going to tell us, you better believe that, or you'll have no meaning to life. How can you live without meaning? You can't. Then, the healing dimension. When life is difficult, it makes you sad, depressed, everything else. And then you need something in your life. And what you find out is you need people in your life. And the people in your life make a difference. They help you, whether you know it or not. But hopefully someday you're going to realize how much people have helped you in healing. And that's what Beverly was talking about when she said, partners in healing. Do you think anyone can really heal from the hardships of life, the pains, the struggles of life, without someone else? Someone who can help us to heal. Of course, you all know the answer. What makes us heal? Love. It's love. And then, of course, the personal dimensions and the memories of life. Fortunately, because the way God made us, we can remember. And when we remember, we begin to understand life in a way that we never understood it before. And then we get a deeper and more fascinating and more, maybe I should say, healthy understanding of life, because we really know what life is all about. Because we've learned that we need people. And also, if we really learned it the right way, we also know that people need us. And I think we also find out that one of the great joys of life is when we know that we're needed and that we are loved. I think I've said enough already.
Okay, I'm going to say a little bit about the article that I have in the book. It's really on illness and faith. And I'll just be very brief about the article to say what's in there. In talking about illness, I use Arthur Frank. Arthur Frank talked about, he had a concept of what he called deep illness. And so let me just say a little bit about that. He says, Deep illness may be critical or chronic. This will go better with glasses. Yes. Deep illness may be critical or chronic, immediately life-threatening or long-term. He says it may have different levels of impairment, and these may fluctuate, but the illness is perceived by the person as lasting. So there's a lot of people suffering from deep illness. And then he says there are 3 stories for deep illness, and I like the way he does this, and I'll just be brief and to say what they are, the 3 stories. He says, the first story that people tell about deep illness is what he calls the restitution story. And he said, I'll read the piece of it. He says, the restitution story tells of getting sick, suffering, being treated, and through treatment being restored to health. This is a story that most of us tell, and most of us want to tell, because it's a success story. Disease is an enemy, and cure is the version of conquering that enemy. This is the kind of story that is expected and encouraged by the medical community, and the kind of story that is often told with extreme relief by the ill person. And let's be honest, we all love to hear restitution stories. That's our favorite. But there are 2 other kinds of stories, he says. The second story, much more difficult. He calls it the chaos story. This kind of story is just the opposite of the restitution story and tells of deep illness. In the chaos story, disability can only increase. Pain will never remit. Physicians are either unable to understand what is wrong or unable to treat it successfully. Typically, in this kind of story, the trouble multiplies and events are compounded. The illness begets a seemingly endless downward spiral of work-related problems, family problems, social problems, insurance problems, financial problems, or housing problems that seem to have little solution. And he says, this is the story that desperately needs to be listened to, but this is the kind of story that is very, very hard to listen to. And we're talking about listening here as a way of working with people with deep illness. And then there's the quest story. In the quest story, illness is understood as a condition from which something can be learned, and this learning can be passed on to others. As Frank sees it, quest stories are being told when the teller claims new qualities of self and believes that illness has been responsible for these changes. Quest stories are about illness leading to new insights. And so these stories don't look to restitution, but these stories to look to what can be now claimed in life. And he says these stories also need to be listened to, and often they're hard to listen to because they're very challenging to us who maybe have not experienced the kind of difficulty that the person who has this deep illness has experienced. So, that's for the listening, that's the kind of stories. The next thing I do in the article is I talk about a chaplain named Paul Andrews. He does something interesting, which I'm happy to talk about very briefly. If anyone had me in class, they know that I always talk about Erik Erikson. Anybody have me in class? Yeah. Did I talk about Erik Erikson? Yeah. Okay. Erikson has these 8 stages of life, beginning with trust versus mistrust, and then autonomy, shame, and doubt in the 2nd, 3rd year of life, and then initiative versus guilt from the 3rd to the 5th year of life, then industry versus inferiority as they're going through adolescence, and then coming to adulthood, identity versus identity confusion, and then he talks about young adulthood, the fullness of young adulthood in terms of intimacy and isolation, and then he talks about the fullness, the real fullness of adulthood in terms of generativity versus despair, and the culmination of the life cycle for him is integrity versus despair. What Andrews says, and I find it a very helpful idea if you're working with anyone who's sick, especially someone with serious illness, especially with someone facing death. And this is what he says, that typically, no matter what age the person is who has the serious illness and often facing death, they tend to regress back to the first stage. So the person could be, say, 25 years old and be told that they have terminal cancer. And what happens? They tend to regress as if they were in the first stage of trust versus mistrust. And they say, who can I trust? Can I trust the doctors? Can I trust my body? Can I trust anybody? So having to begin to rework again the very beginning stage of life. And then after that, some sense of autonomy. Can I be myself? Can I be me? How can I be me with this illness? And how can I be me if I'm facing death? And they have to deal with that. And then the third stage, initiative versus guilt. Often there's a tremendous amount of guilt for getting sick, for being sick, for the problems that other people in the family are caused. So often a tremendous amount of guilt. Part of that sometimes is that it's kind of a revisiting of that stage, whatever. You may fall yourself falling in love with the doctor or the nurse. There's some sexual connection or strong attraction, and it's very surprising to the person who's sick, and then it has to be dealt with the person who's the caretaker. And then, even though they're not at that stage yet, what Erickson would say, and what Andrew says in his article, what he says is, if we're going to die, then even if chronologically we haven't negotiated the stages we should negotiate, like identity, and then intimacy, and then generativity, and then integrity, they get kind of telescoped. And in our own way, even if, for example, we were 25, we have to find intimacy is going to be a big issue. It's like, who can I share this with? Who can I really be myself with? How can I be intimate? It's almost built into the life cycle that we need to do that. And then generativity is built in. And that's not having children or that kind of thing, but it's like, what can I leave of myself to my family or to posterity? What's my legacy? So the question of generativity is there. And all these stages, he says, have to be negotiated in order to be able to die, because Erickson is saying that it's the wholeness of integrity at the end of life that lets you die. But if you're dying at the age of 25, you still need to come to some integrity. So Andrews, in the article that I mentioned in the chapter in the book, he talks about this, and I find it very helpful if you're working with people. That's the second piece. The third piece in my article, I simply talk about imaging God, using my own book, and I'll just be brief with this. But obviously with serious illness, a lot of things happen with one's relationship with God. And for some, it's like loss of faith. Where is God? Huge questioning, which needs to be listened to, needs to be heard. And for some, the image of God they had, which may not be all that mature, is going to deepen. And there's going to be like a fullness, is what I call, in my book, I call it a living God. There's a need to understand God in some kind of fullness, like the wholeness of God. And it's like understanding the wholeness of God lets one understand the wholeness of oneself. And I think, again, for someone, certainly someone facing death, that it's that connection. There's a connection between the self and God. There's an intimacy. There's a deep relationship. That's possible, not for all, but for some. So also saying in the article, in the chapter, is that the image of God has got to be negotiated. And listening to people and being willing to talk to them about where God is for them and how they see God in their lives at the present moment and as they're facing death or in the serious illness. Listening to that and being willing to engage in that conversation is something that's very helpful. Thank you.
Well, at this time I want to focus on, by the way, those who have had John Shea in class know what I mean when I say focus. That's a magic word, isn't it? That's John's favorite word, focus. So I'm going to focus on loss. When Beverly started with this book that came out of her, she said, it would be good for you to write something. So that's the only reason I started to write. And she gave me a couple of choices. One was illness or sickness, dying and death. No, illness, loss, dying and death. So I said, I don't want to do. Sickness I don't want to do. Dying and death. I'll get into loss. Because we don't like to think about that dying and the death and the sickness. But then when I did loss, I found out I was dealing with all of those things. Because that's what loss is. Now, to do all the reading that I had to do in order to write anything intelligent in the chapters, because John's very intelligent, and Beverly, of course. So I said, I got to write something that has substance. So I started to read things, and I read a book that calls about necessary losses. I said, that's the one for me. And this was from a psychologist. I think she is from BC, isn't she? I don't know. No, she isn't. But anyway, Judith Fjorst, one of the professors here, and I went over to the BC bookstore, and that's where I found it. And I said, oh, thank you, Jesus, for finding this book for me. So I read it very, very carefully. And in the book I found out that her title was Necessary Losses. And her theme is that if you're going to live, you're going to lose. Every minute of life, you have it, and you lose it. It's gone. When we're young, we have so many minutes ahead. And then all of a sudden, we get to that point where Jung says we come to the apex. Is that it? The apex, the high point. And then we realize we've lived so many years on this side. The years over here are going to be not so many. That's all loss. And everything in loss, everything in life is loss. So Judith Fjorst, being a psychologist, and a very good one apparently, and a very good writer, she says, there is the first necessary loss, and that is the separation from mother. That's the first loss. And then she calls the last loss the ultimate loss. And then, of course, she wants to give an answer. Everybody wants an answer for, yeah, what happens then? Because life is loss. And that's what I wrote about. And I don't think I found the answer. But what I did find out is I have to find an answer, and we all have to find out the answer. And that's where, oh, they took that off. I'll just have to do this myself if I can remember. That's where your theological dimensions, your psychological dimensions, and then the interrelational dimensions, the connection with other people or the lack of connection with other people come into. Thank you, John. Oh, the healing dimensions, that's right. And then the personal and the, those are the two things. That's the last two aspects. And you know what? The healing dimensions don't come around until you have connections. That's relational. And relational connections are also the things that are going to be lost. Because you possess. Well, you don't exactly possess. You have. You experience. You are gifted with relationships with people. And then, if they love you the way you love them, somebody's going to have a loss. Sometimes you say, I don't want that person I love to have the loss. I'd rather have it myself. That's when there's deep love. Deep love. Because you don't want the pain of loss for someone else, you want to have it for yourself. And that is when you realize that you've learned the lesson in life. And I wanted to tell you something about, I put it right here. When I was doing my research, I started to pay attention to some of the very good writers, and I wanted to tell you about a writer who was a teacher. And he was not far away from Boston College, right here in Massachusetts, of all places. And he became famous. Famous certainly in Massachusetts and probably all over the country, and maybe even wherever people could read English. And he was famous not because he was a Nobel laureate who had made a discovery in physics or chemistry or mathematics or anything like that, but because he was simply a teacher of sociology at a nearby school, university, Brandeis University. He was a teacher of sociology, and he made a discovery that was written about, and he wrote about it in such a way that he became famous. And he wrote about that discovery. He didn't actually write about it himself. Someone else wrote it for him. Do you know why? Because he didn't have time to write it himself. He simply taught that discovery. And you know how he made that discovery? He did it around 1986 when he was diagnosed with, and let me say, I can even remember, because I looked at the book, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And many of you already know who that is, don't you? And I read that book Tuesdays with Maury Swartz. And he was such a wonderful teacher, he made an impact. And what I found in the very beginning was a marvelous thing. He loved people, but he loved them for their substance. And one day he had a visitor who had heard about Maury Swartz, and he wanted him to be on his television program. And that person was probably even more famous than a Nobel laureate, Ted Koppel. So he came, and some of you have already read this, I know, but for me it was a revelation. When I read what he did, he was talking about loss. Ted Koppel came to see him, and he said, and all of his crew, his entourage, came, and they all said, okay, we're going to set up, and let's get Maury Swartz right out here. Let him tell his story, and this will be a big smash on TV. And when he got into the room, Maury Swartz says, wait a minute. I think I'd like to find out who this Ted Koppel is. So he invited Ted Koppel in. And his people who take care of him said, "You can't do that to Ted Koppel. Interview him. He came to interview you." And he said, "Well, I'm not going to talk to anybody unless I know what this person is." So Ted Koppel went inside. And then Maurice Schwartz said to him, "I want to know what it is that means so much to you in your life." And Ted Koppel said, "Well, that's what I came to ask you." And he said, "No, I want to know about you." And then he said, oh, I better find this, I'm sorry. He said, "What do you love? What's the most important thing?" And Ted Koppel realized he was up against it. And he said, "Well, Maurice said, "Do you love your children?" Oh, yeah, of course. I said, do you really love them? Do you really know them? And do they know how much you love you? You love them. Anyway, that's what happened. But then I wanted to pay attention to how Maurice Schwartz dealt with his student from years ago. And he asked him the same thing. And Mitch Albion learned that lesson. And he wanted to share it with us. And that is the great discovery. So I can't give you the answer. I tried very hard. But I found out the answer for myself. And I found it out by looking at another book that I read very carefully. And this was all about loss. And it was called The Other Side of Sadness by George Bonanno. And this book is all about loss. But it's also about what we believe in life and how what we believe makes a difference. Because we need to know meaning in life. And if we don't have that meaning, we don't have anything. So he wrote about all of his cases, and he was very eclectic in his desire to understand all of that. And he went to China at one time because he has a Chinese wife. And because she spoke Chinese fluently, he had the courage to go there. And he was estranged from his father, who died when he was a young man. And he had never dealt with that. He had never really made a connection with his father. And he wanted to heal that, and had never done anything that would heal it for him. So he wanted to know how to do all this, and he went with his wife to China. And he found out that the Chinese have rituals, and we may think of them as curious rituals, but he found out that the rituals are important because that's where the healing and the memories and the personal dimensions of loss, sickness, and death and dying and death come in. The memories that we have and how the relationships continue or they don't continue depending upon what you believe. And when I read some of these things, I found them to be fascinating. And one of them especially, he was also a psychologist, George Bonanno, and he's done a lot of research on grief, because loss causes grief. We grieve for what's gone, what we can never recapture. Now, Maurice Schwartz when Mitch Albin asked him, he says, "Do you ever envy the young?" And he said, "No." He said, "Well, I do. Because I used to dance. And I used to have a good time. And I used to teach. And I met people like you. And I don't have that anymore." But he said, "I was 30 once. And now it's time for me to be 75. And he said, I don't envy them. I want them to enjoy being young. And I don't think as we get older, we need to envy. We have to find the joy that we had and realize the greatest joy we have is the connection we have with one another. And as George Bonanno ended his book, well, first of all, he had found out that the Chinese realize that you have to make connections with what you've lost. And George Bonanno left his father and his family when he was a young man, about 23. And he said, how can I get back in touch with my father who died? And then he went over to China. And of all places, that's where he found out that the strange ritual, he said, it was kind of like a Buddhist thing. They have little paper gifts that they give to those who have died. And the gifts represent the relationship, the love. And those gifts are the way that we begin to deepen our sense, our belief, our conviction in the connections that never disappear. Even though we know that death separates us, we're connected. And he did a simple experiment with his father. He had the courage to do it, because when he finally decided, what can I give my father that'll represent me as a gift to him? And he said, well, I could build him a house. I always wanted to build my father a house, but I never got around to it. He said I could give him something that represents my love that I never expressed. And he said, you know, my father was very practical. He never wasted money. He never spent money on himself. And the Chinese have these little gold bullions. It represents a gold rock, gold coin, not coins, big things. And he said, I'm going to make one of them, and then I'm going to take it to the furnace and burn it up. And that's what he did. He burned it up. And then he said, a strange thing happened. He said, I said, hello, Dad. And he had never tried to say that before, just to himself, but he said it in the little bit of Chinese that he knew. And he said that healed him, made him to go back. And those things can make the difference with the pain and the suffering. And this I read in the end of his book, when he had a client who suffered very, very much from losing a child that she loved dearly. And this probably is the hardest thing to get over. And he said his client had this pain for at least 35 years. And so he was asking, I asked Karen Everly about this, and she allowed her name to be used. I asked her if she could sum up what bereavement felt like years after the death of her daughter. She looked thoughtful. Her words apply the answer she gave. I think to anyone who has ever mourned a loved one. And these are her words. It's a bit like a fading light. It grows dim. But it never goes out. Never. Not completely, anyway. I find that enormously reassuring. I used to worry that someday the light would disappear, that I would forget, and then I really would have lost Claire. I know now that doesn't happen. It can't. There is always a little flicker there. It is like the small glowing embers you see after a fire dies down. I carry that around with me, that little ember. And if I need to, if I want to have Claire next to me, I blow on it ever so gently, and it glows bright again. She found that to be healing. And then I just made a very little short endeavor of my own. I tried to put that into poetry for myself. Oh, I have it. Love endures beyond time and space. Love lives on in a remembered place. And so, a sigh of the heart brings flame from a spark.
Thank you. You can appreciate, I think, how difficult it is to follow these two great men and two great thinkers. Let me begin by telling you a true story. In May of 1990, I was stressed beyond my limits, completing the writing of my PhD, tabulating data, preparing for my oral defense in June, and working 50 hours a week. Because of this mental and emotional overload, the truth of the statement, "the body remembers," became for me a stark reality. Obviously, I was running on empty, and I was brought to a screeching halt. My heart was racing over 200 beats a minute, and I found myself in a CCU unit. Anxious, weak, confused, and weepy, I was more concerned about the deadline for my dissertation than I was for my health. Some of you might be able to understand that. After several hours of doctors and specialists gathering around me speaking in anxious terms, and beginning a series of tests and treatments, they all finally left my room. My friends and colleagues who were with me also were asked to leave. Now alone in this empty silence, I face myself. The walls seemed to close in on me, and my mind turned to the words of the great poet Yeats. Now that my ladder is gone, I must lie down where all ladders start, in the foul, ragabone shop of my heart. This seemingly protective CCU unit consisted of a small room with 3 glass walls. Many strange machines were ticking and clicking and beeping like hens. I could not make any sense out of the mysterious lines and scratches that beamed over and over on the computer above my bed. I realized I'm like a prisoner, held captive by wires and tubes, all going in different directions. Like this, I tried to pray. At that moment, my wonderful doctor came into my room, not with his usual smile and calmness, but with a very serious expression, reflecting something painful. As he sits on my bed, he expresses his concern. If we can get you through the night, he says, we will then be able to work on a plan to get you better. Amazed and startled and somewhat bewildered, I heard the if. What is my problem, I ask. That was when I was first introduced to ventricular tachycardia. I ask for a layperson's definition, and I hear the ominous reply. It means sudden death. And then I said, are you telling me I could die at any moment? A kindly but a dreaded response came back. Yes. But with proper medication and treatment, we will be able to get your arrhythmia under control. And he said, I will see you through this process. And he did. Alone once again, I'm left in this chilling silence, beating off the glass walls. I try once again to pray. Meeting God face to face tonight might be a real possibility. I want to meet you, Lord, surely, but some other time, please. I begged. And then I added quickly, I have some work to complete first. My anxiety rushed me headlong into the seashore of my mind, collapsing me in this rag and bone shop of my heart. I begin to examine my life, ask forgiveness, give thanks for all the special people in my life. And then the waves of anxiety, like a heavy tsunami, overwhelmed my sense of safety and my very existence. Tethered to the bed and alone, I feel like an animal caught in a cage. All of this is overwhelming, and I cry. I cry from the depths of my soul. God, be with me. As I try to hold on to my life by my fingernails, the night shift of nursing staff come in. What happens then is that in this middle of my emotional tsunami, a beautiful, peace-bearing black nurse enters my room. After a very brief greeting, she says, sleeping will help your heart to grow stronger. Do you think you could go to sleep? I had not lost my total sense of humor, so I said to her, easier for you than me. But she had great empathy, and she said, yes, you are in a serious condition. I understand, but a good sleep will help your heart. Then this total stranger did something and said something that I believe changed my life. She said very graciously, I will take my chair and sit it here in your doorway. I will be able to hear every change, and I will monitor your condition. I am with you. Desperately, I search her compassionate eyes, and finally, her eyes tell me I can believe her, and I fall fast asleep. The next morning, somewhere around 5 a.m., I awake. Through my eyelashes, I am able to see a faint vision that is forever etched in my mind. In the low, dim lights of the CCU unit, I glimpse this warm, compassionate angel of mercy sitting in a hard-backed chair in the doorway of my life and death. This sight of a total stranger sitting with me through this dark night of the soul moves me to uncontrollable tears and profound gratitude. It looks like we made it, I say. And she said cheerfully, we sure did. Weeks later, I was released from this cold, glass-walled tomb and wires and tubes. And when I got home and was feeling better, I decided I must buy a lovely gift and bring to that gracious woman who sat with me through my night, giving me courage and hope. So I go back to the hospital, and I ask to meet with the head nurse, and I tell her the night that I was there and the time, and I share with her what this gorgeous nurse looked like. And she goes over to her book and goes through it, and she came back to me and she said, "No one stayed with you that night. We do not have any nurse in this department that looks like that." Illness is often a detour, often a jarring moment in time that calls forth courage in the face of fear. It questions the meaning of life, and serious illness ushers in serious life tasks. Karl Rahner calls this task, and I quote, "The surrender of the self trustfully and hopefully to the insoluble mystery we call God." Illness is a system. The paradoxical gift of illness offers not only to the patient, but to the family, to co-workers, to loved ones, a challenge. It is a dangerous opportunity for everyone. In the chapter, I discuss 4 psychological dimensions: the family, the self, differentiation, anxiety, and empathy. And then I conclude with looking at this mystery of illness through the eyes of faith. The great German theologian Dorothy Sola uses the paradoxical expression, the silent cry, as a mystical name for God. She invites us to hear the often inaudible silent cry in ourselves, in others, and in the world. I believe the silent cry is at the heart of living with loss, illness, and death. Spiritual leaders speak of graced moments when the thin places and spaces occur, and the barrier between the real and the unreal collapse. Michael Himes, from Boston College, states it this way, and I quote, "The grace of God is here, always here. But what is missing all too often is someone to behold it. Those moments when we become beholders of grace are sacramental moments. All of us, day by day, are learning to be such beholders. Grace is found everywhere." So let me close as I began. Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was gift.